Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, December 6th. We were just debating which of the 100 news stories this week we should really be focusing on because, my God, we had a lot of stuff going on, including the nullification of an election in Romania just a few hours ago by the Supreme Court. But what we're really going to look at are three big stories that dominated the news this week. First, a look at a coup, or at least an attempted coup in Korea, which lasted all of 6 hours as President Yoon declared martial law, and then, as soon as the parliament reacted, walked away from that. Then Syria. It's back in the news because rebel forces are marching on not just the capital, are marching almost on the capital. They took Aleppo, they took Hama and Hama, and we'll see how far they're going to get. And then finally, France. The government collapses this week, and a country deeply divided between three different political forces on the left, center, and right is finding it increasingly difficult to decide who is going to govern them. Those are the things that we're going to be looking at this week with three reporters who cover them. Anna Sauerbrey is foreign editor at Die Zeit. Peter Spiegel is U.S. managing editor at the Financial Times, and David Luhnow is the U.K. bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. Good morning, Peter. Good afternoon, Anna and David. Wonderful to have you. Peter, let's start with you. Korea, my God, what a story. Martial law for the first time since democracy was restored in South Korea in the late 1980s, and it lasted all of 6 hours.
So there are two elements of this story which I think are important. One, frankly, you mentioned the Romanian story from this morning about the Supreme Court, or the Constitutional Court there, annulling the presidential election. In that respect, the Korea story is about democratic norms and how democratic norms may be withering in the wake of Trump's election or other elements that are happening elsewhere in the world. So in that sense, when you talk to U.S. officials in Washington, I was at an event just a couple days ago with Kirk Campbell, who's sort of the chief Asia hand in the Biden administration. They are kind of trying to paint this as a good news story, which is, hey, 6-hour coup, democracy reasserted itself, protests in the street, and then the parliament stepped in and overturned it. So that's an important part of this story. But I want to focus a little bit more on the geopolitics of this, because it is a far less good story for the U.S. interest in the region geopolitically. And frankly, it's a bit of a black eye for Biden on his way out, because one of the things that not only Biden, but frankly, presidents going back 20 to 30 years have been working on in East Asia is trying to set up what we in the industries tend to call a security architecture. It's a boring word for what happens in Europe right now post-war is NATO, right? You have a treaty that organizes itself to deal with the Russian threat and whatever threat you have in Europe. That never existed in Asia. The U.S. has tried to get its treaty allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, and then also to a certain extent the Philippines and New Zealand, to work together in some sort of joint way. It's always instead been hub and spoke, right? So they want to work with Washington, they want to work with each other. However, just last year, in one of, I would argue, one of the biggest foreign policy coups of the Biden administration that no one paid attention to, there was a Camp David meeting, tripartite meeting between the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the Americans, in which the Cold War, frankly, Cold War is too strong a word, but there was the actual detente between the Koreans and the Japanese, two most important allies of the U.S. in East Asia, finally said, we are going to jointly work together on exercises, on intelligence sharing. Huge moment for the U.S. in its ability to create that joint architecture in Asia. And the person who really mattered in that was President Yoon of Korea, because the Koreans are not actually domestically, politically, that enthusiastic about embracing the Japanese because of historical reasons, right? The Japanese still don't acknowledge some of their historical problems in Korea from the imperial period, from the war period. Yoon stuck his neck out, and Biden was able rightfully to declare victory. Well, suddenly, the guy that they put all their marbles in the basket for declares martial law. And again, the administration's been trying to put a happy face on this by saying, "Oh, democracy has been restored. It shows the strength of Korean democracy after 40 years, of actual democracy following military rule in Korea." But I got to say, I really, when I saw this story, my heart sank a bit, because I really did think that we are on the verge of something real in East Asia, because it has taken so long for particularly countries that have had a bad history with Japan for the war. You don't hear that in Asia anymore. They're so worried about the Chinese threat that literally almost overnight in the last 2 or 3 years, and also, frankly, the Ukraine war, we shouldn't forget, because there was a belief, in particular in Japan, that, oh, there's a world order, we don't have to really worry about our own self-defense. The Ukraine war shattered that, and you saw a change in sentiment. You saw bilateral deals going on between Japan and the Philippines, Japan and Australia, and suddenly you began to see the allies in Asia, from Hokkaido down to Tasmania, that whole ring that surrounds China, really working together and forming their own security architecture to counter the Chinese. It is really, really bad for Yoon to be pulled out of that, because he's going to be impeached. He's probably going to be removed or resign. And it's a really bad day, I think, for U.S. foreign policy in the region that this happened.
Thanks, Peter. I think you hit both the key points. One is the democracy point, and what does it say about the stability of democratic governance, which is a question many of us are raising each and every day, almost everywhere. And then sort of this geopolitical issue that I think you rightly pointed out, and Yoon was the glue of this whole thing. So, David, just to take either one of those or both, but sort of. The democracy, both of them, let me put it this way, are being influenced by what's happening in Washington, where, of course, a new president is not known for his devotion to democracy, at least abroad. Hopefully he is at home, and who would also raise some serious questions about the American commitment to working together with its allies. And at the moment that the allies themselves need to figure out how do they have to do more, perhaps with less United States. So how do you read the last sort of the piece? And you're muted. Sort of the last piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. Well, I maybe have with Trump. I think you're right. In Asia, though, Trump has promised, as have every American government since Obama, sort of a pivot to Asia. So, I think the message from Trump has been more, if you're European and being a quote unquote deadbeat, not paying your way, you're going to be expected to start paying your way. He's made that sort of loud and clear, as has, by the way, every American has complained about Europe not pulling its weight on security since Eisenhower. So it's not a new complaint. It's just that Trump is more willing to break some China along the way to make his point. He's gone a lot further, and obviously sort of does undermine the purpose of NATO. In Asia, I would think that would be more secure. I was going to ask Peter, actually, I had sort of a comment and a question. When I saw the news from South Korea, I immediately told my colleagues here in the office, well, this guy's going to be gone by the end of the week. And they said, why? And I said, well, I have a long history of reporting in Latin America. And if you're going to launch a coup, you better have the guys with guns. And it just didn't seem to me like he had sort of thought this through. And the moment Parliament started meeting again, I thought, oh, this guy's toast. So that, it's just a comment about, if a leader anywhere is going to move, you need the guys with guns. That's why it's been so hard to dislodge people like Maduro and Ortega and Nicaragua and Venezuela, because they have the guys with guns and they bought them off, and they make sure that if somebody needs shooting, they get shot. But if you're not willing to resort to that kind of extreme violence, which thank goodness Korea's president was not, then you're probably going to lose a move like this, a power play like this. My second point was sort of a question. How much of this was actually a budget issue? And I asked that because, given the events in France and more recently in Germany with budget issues, it feels like governments wrangling over budgets are becoming a bigger issue, kind of East and West. But I was just curious how much of this was sort of over that.
Well, there's a peculiarity. I mean, look, you talk to people in Washington, and the first thing they say is Yoon was key to our geostrategic positioning in Asia. The second thing they'll say very quickly is he's a bit of an odd dude. He is not your typical Korean in particular, but frankly anywhere, leader, then they all find him slightly odd. If you remember his trip to Washington, he sang, gosh,
American Pie.
That's right, American Pie. I mean, he is slightly odd. He is a career prosecutor. He does not come from the political elites, so he's very unpopular domestically. So there was some budget issue, but there was much more. They're investigating his wife and her ties to media companies and stuff like that. So there was a lot of domestic political strife that led to this. I would also make a point, though, on your don't get the guys with guns. Be self-aggrandizing this. You also got to get the media, right? You get the broadcaster. The one thing I'll disagree with you, though, on is the extent to which Trump affects East Asia, because I think you're underselling. I mean, obviously it's important for Europe, but remember, he stepped into North Korea, right? He basically wanted to deal with Kim at all costs, and repeatedly said, "Why are we spending money on doing joint exercises? Cancel joint exercises with the Koreans." And the Japanese. They won't admit it, but I know from American diplomats in the region, the Japanese have basically part of the reason they have doubled their defense spending is they feel under a Trump administration they were being abandoned by their most important ally. So I think we underestimate that both the Ukraine war and the Trump presidency, we tend to see it, I think, as transatlantic. It's having a huge impact on our allies in East Asia. I mean, again, even look at the Australians with the AUKUS deal. The fact that a Australian military that's been relying on a small fleet of diesel submarines has decided finally to build a proper fleet of nuclear subs, right? They are rearming in Asia to a level that we not are really paying attention to. And if you believe peace through strength and the way Reagan talked about it, for Americans, this is a good thing. But if we see the international architecture that we sort of relied on in the post-war world collapsing at the same time, you're seeing a rearmament and the Chinese being much more aggressive. Boy, that's a really, really dangerous recipe, I think. And I think we have to keep an eye on developments in East Asia, even though we're paying attention to Gaza, we're paying attention to Ukraine. Because I think there's a real danger out there, particularly under Trump, that if our East Asian allies feel that they're being abandoned, that they're going to be forced to be more aggressive in the region against the Chinese and others. And that's a recipe for real danger, I would say.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And South Korea is pretty central to that. And Yoon was the person who did it. And once Yoon is gone, it's not clear that the South Koreans aren't going to say, "Wait a minute, maybe we're better off being nice to the Chinese."
And because just to put a point on that, Ivo, because the reason that has been his historical problem is they are much more worried about North Korea than they are about China, and they need the Chinese to help them on North Korea, and that's been the tension also with the Japanese. So they could revert to that very easily.
Yeah, exactly. Anna, join in here. Take either the geostrategic or the democracy piece, or both. What struck you most about this story this week?
Yeah, I just want to share an unorthodox theory about why he did it, that our China correspondent just presented to us in a conversation we had about South Korea this week, that he might have had just too much soyu, which is like a spirit made of rice, which is apparently very sweet. I haven't tasted it, but it's hard to tell when you've had enough. But that aside, what struck me was that this is another government that's just not there when Trump takes office, and this, of course, has a lot of resemblances with the situation in Europe we have right now, with France and Germany just not being there, just not having any governments with any authority when he takes office. And I agree that they cannot depend on Trump to continue the Asia policy of the Biden administration. I've just flipped through some of the Trump books that I have very many of in my shelf. And when you look at what he did and said about South Korea in his first term, it's really scary. I mean, Bob Woodward reports that he almost tore up the American-South Korean trade agreement, and that his aides kept it from his desk so he couldn't do so. He later amended it. And the same is true for a story H.R. McMaster told about his journeys with Trump to China, when Trump said to Xi, well, yeah, this is a very costly relationship. And that too resembles the situation in Europe when we await the deal maker taking office and demanding from us that they pay up. So this is a very dangerous situation for South Korea, I think, and they're just not there, just like France and Germany.
I think that's exactly right. And by the way, in Japan also has a minority government. There is this the challenge of Trump is coming exactly at the time when governments are increasingly unable to even get their own budgets through, as David rightly put it, and dealing with day-to-day affairs. And it strikes me that their option isn't only to say, okay, we need to do more and figure out how to do it. The other option is just to submit, and either submit to China or submit to whomever, and just accept and go with the wind. Which, by the way, is kind of how the world politics used to be. The weak shall do what they must, and the strong shall do as they will. Thucydides said a long time ago. By the way, Putin in a speech quoted Thucydides approvingly a couple of weeks ago. So in some ways, it seems to me that countries are looking and saying, okay, we just don't have the power to resist.
Ivo, on that point, just one last thing on you. Look at the Philippines. I mean, the Philippines is suddenly, of the last 4 years, has agreed to bring American troops back and give them access to ports that face China. Right? This is the former colony of the United States inviting us back completely. What do they do now? What do they do now? I mean, remember, Duterte basically decided he had to side with the Chinese for exactly the reason you said. If the U.S. is not going to back us anymore, and we're going to exit the region, the biggest power is China. We have to give in. And I think watching the Philippines as a canary in the coal mine is worth doing.
Well, the Philippines and frankly, South Korea without Yoon, right? Because Yoon was pretty unique. I mean, the South Korean public opinion is decidedly not necessarily even pro-American. And since the left, and particularly on the left, that is the case. And the left is if anything, strengthened by what happened in the last week. Talk about governments in trouble, David, which may be a good segue to Syria. All of a sudden, this instability that the last year, or is it instability? The upheaval of the Middle East is now affecting Syria all of a sudden, and we've seen a remarkable change in the military dynamic inside Syria. By the way, a Russian ally, which allowed Syria to win the civil war in the beginning. Now, the whole question of where is Syria going and what is going to happen is up in the air. So tell us, David, what happened this week, and what should we make of it? You're on mute, David.
So sorry about that. This was unexpected. I think it's a tough one. Everybody had sort of grown used to the stalemate that had been sort of the result of the Syrian civil war. I wouldn't say, I mean, Assad won it in quotes because he didn't have full control over his country. But yes, for the last 4 years, there's been sort of a stalemate. What's remarkable to me as I was thinking about this, it really goes back to the Arab Spring. And this is, talk about your long tail of events. I mean, it's hard to recall now the sort of the giddy sense of optimism that so many of us felt back when governments in Tunisia and Egypt first fell. When I got sent to Cairo to cover the sort of fallout from the Arab Spring early on, and I didn't know Egypt well, and it was intoxicating meeting all these young Egyptians that were, social media savvy and really aware of the world. And, many spoke English, sort of wanting democracy. And you sort of thought, yes, the time has come. And I remember a colleague at the time taking me aside and saying, you haven't seen the rest of this country. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, I'm going to take you out to the countryside. I'm going to take you to the suburbs of Cairo, and you're going to meet the real Egypt. So we began meeting lots of other kinds of Egyptians. And what he meant was, in a way, kind of be careful what you wish for in places where there aren't strong institutions, where democracy and democratic institutions haven't been nurtured. Kind of goes back to the old Why Nations Fail book, which I think is so good at explaining why some countries do better than others in some senses. And sure enough, Muslim Brotherhood takes over, military stops that in its tracks. So Egypt backslides, Libya, NATO intervened, and now the country's split in two. And the fallout was kind of especially brutal in Syria with the long civil war. any idea that NATO was going to check Assad was sort of laid to rest by the problems in Libya and by Russia and China and the Security Council. So what you are left with is this sort of horrific civil war in a country kind of riven by tribal differences. Assad's Alawites are only 13% of the country, the Shia another 13%, and the rest are Sunnis. So it's a bit of a powder keg when these 75% of Sunni aren't a part of the governing institutions or the army of the country. So, of course, this also drew in other powers. Assad, as you rightly pointed out, stayed in power backed by Russia and Iran, which uses Syria to project its power across the region and giving it a gateway to Lebanon and Hezbollah, which also helped Assad, and being right next to Israel, where it can cause problems for its arch enemy. The U.S. intervened after the rise of Islamic State, and then Turkey intervened because it was worried about the Kurds and about stability on its border. So you have this sort of cauldron of both internal problems that draws in external actors. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this was sort of semi-stable until last week, when maybe Russia's distracted by Ukraine, Iran is distracted by its proxy war with Israel, and so suddenly HTS, a Sunni Islamic group, breaks out of its little statelet in northern Syria and sort of goes on the march. And very quickly, government forces, kind of reminiscent a little bit to the way the forces in Afghanistan sort of folded at the first sign of resistance, faded away. And now, of course, if you mentioned they've taken Hama, they're on their way to Homs. It looks like they're on the march. So this really juggles things up. We had a story this week that was talking about, well, who are these guys? Who are HTS, and what can we make of them? I mean, they sort of seem this blend of sort of, they were, of course, linked to Al Qaeda, but their leader has since dropped that. They are no longer as extreme a terror group as they perhaps were. Yet, they might be considered more like the Taliban or Hamas. They do fight under the banner of a Syrian flag. They say they're not interested in exporting Islamic ideology elsewhere. They're a nationalist movement. But we had a quote from a woman in the story who's a Christian woman living in Aleppo, and she said, well, I was sort of thinking the world was ending when these guys were coming in, but so far so good. Others say it's sort of like the old metaphor of the parable of the scorpion and the frog, that if these guys do take power, sort of, again, be careful what you wish for, because they might end up bringing something just as bad as Assad's faction. So it's one of these really, really complicated situations where there doesn't seem to be anyone to kind of root for. The Turks have sort of seem to be on the up right now because they are more or less linked to HTS. They have influence over them. Syria and Russia finding their sort of stock declining. But how long is this going to take before Russia decides to send some glide bombs toward the front lines and use its military bases to really go all in to defend Assad again? I mean, I think this is far from done. It'd be interested to hear your opinions on where this goes next, but it just seems like sort of instability all around, and the again unresolved long tail of the Syrian civil war. It's kind of remarkable how long this has lasted.
David, can I ask you? You touched on this very quickly, but if you could delve in it a little bit more, which is the Russian angle, because you mentioned, and I think other reporting has borne this out, that this perhaps is happening because of the Russians being distracted. And we've seen at least reports of sacking of Russian commanders and that kind of thing. Can you talk a bit more about is that to what extent that is indeed the case, and that the Russians will struggle to reinforce Assad, or frankly, probably even better news, are forced to divert forces from the main event in Ukraine to Syria? I mean, again, it's a little bit crystal balling, I know, so it's very difficult to say. But do you have a view on what this tells us about the Russian military and Russians' ability to project power abroad?
I don't really. I mean, they have bases in Syria. I was looking them up on the map, and they have assets there. So I would imagine, they are going to think very quickly in these days whether they want to deploy these or not. A colleague of mine had a briefing here at the UK Ministry of Defense, and the Brits are now saying that Russian casualties in Ukraine have reached a peak, or the highest rate ever of the war so far. I mean, they are getting absolutely the meat grinder strategy before Trump takes power is definitely in full force there. And the Ukrainians, of course, always suffer higher casualties when the Russians do as well. So they're all in there right now. It's a heck of a time for this to happen as far as Russia goes. As far as their bandwidth, it's really hard to tell. It's going to say a lot, though. I think you're right to ask that question, because if Russia doesn't respond, boy, then it does look sort of like a paper tiger, but not being able to project its power in an area where it's seen as sort of its backyard, where it wants to project power, going back to the sort of the great game days. So, if they can't, what does that say? And similarly, I think it's going to be interesting to watch Iran. They're also in a tough position, and Hezbollah has been decimated. So, boy, everyone's kind of limping, and you've got to wonder, what are the Israelis making of all this? They've got to be thinking, there was some thought that maybe Assad could be peeled a little bit away from Iran's orbit, that the Arab League was going to let him back in, and maybe they could sort of start to wield more leverage over him, offer him money, try to peel him away from Iran's influence. But like the whole sort of Saudi, grand bargain thing before the Hamas October 7 attacks, that's all sort of blown up now, and it's sort of wait and see what happens and sort of cross fingers.
Anna, jump in here. I think this, and David started to paint the picture of all these outside forces, including the United States, by the way, which the U.S. still has troops in Syria for counter-terrorist operations. All these outside forces, one, seem to have been caught unaware, and two, it's not clear that they have any real fundamental ability to affect it. Certainly the Iranians don't. The question of what about the Turks, which we haven't mentioned, because the Turks are pretty strong on that. So how do you see it in terms of the outside forces here, and also what is likely to happen in the weeks ahead with the government, in some ways, forces collapsing pretty rapidly?
I think it's very hard to project what happens next right now. One thing I would like to point out, that this is, of course, also connected to Israel's war against Hezbollah and its attacks on Hezbollah targets in Syria. It appears that the weakening of Hezbollah in Syria and the weakening of Hezbollah overall in the war with Israel is one of the many reasons why this is happening now, or at least we can look at it from today's perspective, looking back, because I think nobody really expected this. I just talked to our correspondent in Jerusalem today, who says that the Israeli government and sort of the security establishment scene for now is pretty calm about it. But of course, this might change. They have, of course, the Golan Heights, which are always unstable, and they certainly cannot afford another war. There, Netanyahu feels vindicated for now with the truce with Hezbollah. Everybody's hoping that it will hold. There have been clashes, and I think that for now they're looking at it quietly. But of course, they don't want another full-out war with many other regional and global players involved in their imminent neighborhood. As for how the others are going to react, my question to you would be, as you know America's foreign policy better than I do, how would Trump react? You've mentioned the couple of hundred troops that the United States still have in the country, and they felt compelled to act, I think, last on Tuesday night, firing at Hezbollah forces. The Pentagon said it was only to protect those on the ground. What would happen if they were targeted by any of the groups acting in Syria now? Would the U.S. be willing to engage more? Would those troops be withdrawn? What would that mean for the other rebel groups that they are supporting at present in the south of the country? Those are the questions I have, and I would like to hear you on that.
Well,
Can I
remember
just
Yeah, I wanted to, Peter, jump in, but remember, just to add to Anna's point, remember that Trump has always wanted to pull the troops out of Syria. In fact, he's claimed numerous times that they had been pulled out of Syria, but Mattis and the Pentagon were basically say, well, yeah, you may want to, but we're not doing it. And so maybe this time he will get it done. So Peter, jump in.
Well, I was going to actually address something else that Anna pointed out, because the one country she mentioned Hezbollah and the role the Israeli war has played in this, but obviously the one country we haven't mentioned is Iran, right? And I think it may have been David's Fine News organization that had a story on this, but it's been interesting to see what has been happening with Iran. It's hard to know from the inside, but obviously Hezbollah has been severely damaged by the Israeli campaign. Obviously, Hamas has also been damaged, along with the rest of the West Bank, by the Israeli. And there's been a lot of reporting. Again, I think the Journal's done an excellent job on this, about what has happened inside Iran from the Israeli airstrikes. And there is some belief, I think, in U.S. intelligence circles that actually Iran is severely weakened right now. And I think what we're seeing in Syria may be a byproduct of that. The inability of the Iranians to prop up its axis of whatever you want to call it, because Syria is not part of that axis necessarily. But clearly they have worked for decades to back up the Alawites in Syria, not only the current Assad, but Hafez al-Assad before. So it's really, in terms of actors, we really need to watch the Iranians. The U.S., obviously, not only do we have the problem of Trump wanting to withdraw, there is also a very important American ally in the region, which are the Kurds, right? We have basically taken on the Kurds as our proxy in the region, and we have a very bad history of abandoning them. And I fear that actually, if Trump comes in, our poor Kurdish friends will find themselves on the back end again.
Not only us, but the British and various other people have abandoned them as well.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's part of the whole regional history. The whole history is not only the Kurds, but everybody else. If you want to know what a Hobbesian world looks like, this is certainly one part of it. Just the decimation of Hezbollah was also important in the sense that Hezbollah was a critical player in Syria's ability to gain significant. Didn't win the civil war, as I think David rightly says, but make the progress that it did, and Hezbollah just isn't able to do that anymore.
And Ivo, can I make a point about Israel again? I think it's because it speaks to this point about Hezbollah. I mean, for Israel, obviously Assad's regime has allowed Iran to use Syria as a pathway to arm Hezbollah. So, ending that would be a huge gain for Israel in making sure Hezbollah stays sort of neutered. But the flip side is, well, if that ends and his regime falls only to be replaced by an Islamist regime, then, is that better? Is that better for the Israelis or not? I mean, it's sort of a careful what you wish for. So I think they're a bit alarmed and on edge, looking at how does this affect us down in Tel Aviv.
Yeah, there's a region that keeps on giving when it comes to news, as we can say. We haven't talked much about Europe, Anna. So let's turn there. And I guess one of the reasons we haven't touched a lot on Europe is because Europe is very preoccupied with itself, and that starts with France, where the government, the elections that Macron called 6 months ago, produced instability that doesn't seem to be ending. But this week, the story took another big turn. So, bring us up to date, and where do you what do you expect is going to happen?
Yeah, speaking of complicated political environments with a lot of 2- and 3-letter abbreviated groups, which we have in Syria and in the French Parliament, as we speak today, 2 things I think are happening in France after the government was toppled. The one thing that Macron is already out looking for a new prime minister, speaking to the different caucuses in the French Parliament and particularly their leaders, doing the tour again that he did over the summer until they agreed on Barnier forming a minority government, which proved not to be very stable. And the other thing, of course, is the big blame game and the question of who will profit and who will lose in this. And of course, this is first a problem for Macron. From my point of view, he's the one who stands defeated. It was a very risky and hazardous move this summer to resolve the parliament after major losses in the European election. And he gambled on new elections in France to strengthen his group, which went terribly wrong. And he ended up with a prime minister and a minority government. In his speech, anyway, on Thursday, on December 5th at night, he was very defiant. He said that his mandate was 5 years and he intended to execute it. And of course, it would be suicidal to call new elections now and have presidential elections now. And still, I doubt that voters buy it. And this is not good news for the elections in 2027 if he really does last until then. But I think it's also a question of what this means for Marine Le Pen, who rejected far-reaching offers by Barnier to bring down the government. She clearly was after bringing down the government. And she now argues she has fought for France's retirees, which is also always a good argument in France to make. But she clearly wanted the government to fall. And this sort of eats away on her narrative of the Rassemblement National party being less radical, being a party ready to bear responsibility for the nation as a whole. And of course, she's got trouble in court coming on. She has been accused of misappropriating European funds for her own good. And she faces trial early next year. And the prosecution has demanded 5 years in prison. And she might not be able to run in the next election. So I think this is a pretty open situation right now, like who really benefits, also depending on her legal troubles. Of course, as I've said before, this comes at the worst time possible with Donald Trump taking office and the war in Ukraine in a very critical phase. And the big neighbor, Germany, also being without a government. We only have our elections on February 23rd, and we'll probably need a couple of months to find a government too. So the question has always been like, who's the United States going to call in Europe? It will not be France. It will not be Germany. It might be the Commission, but Donald Trump is famously known for not taking the EU too seriously. So I think what we might see, or what I'm interested in, what I'm following right now, is maybe the center of gravity shifting to the Nordic and Baltic states, who've just held a big summit in Sweden at the end of November. Donald Tusk of Poland was a special guest there. So there's new centers coming up, and I think that's something we should watch in the coming months.
And that was great in terms of what's going on in France and its wider implication. You really do see the center of Europe sort of crumbling, because which is ultimately where the money and the might is. Great for the Nordics and the Balts to get together, but when you add them up, they are important, but they don't quite get to the same weight as the Germans and the French have it. David, you mentioned earlier budget issues, and clearly that was a key issue. But the political issue also, there is no political agreement on the budget issues in France, and the left, which by the way won the election, came out as the strongest, seems to have been ignored by Macron and everybody else. And I wonder whether the time has come that they are moving forward and saying, well, now actually we need to be part of this.
I chose our Paris meeting room, by the way. You'll have noticed this was chosen for a reason. I don't know a lot about French politics, but I would say that it feels to me, sitting here in the UK, that a lot of European countries are hitting up against, I don't know if it's a tipping point, but a level where They have structurally rising costs due to an aging population and other factors, healthcare, other things, with revenues that are not growing because these economies aren't growing. And how to square that circle is going to become the great question of a lot of European politics, I think, in a lot of individual countries going forward. There are issues in Germany on this. France is always sort of interesting to look at. And it feels, even here in the UK, Starmer's been in power for 5 months, and he's already pretty deeply unpopular. They had their first budget, and people didn't like it. And this is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. I mean, governments are not coming clean to people, that there are going to need to be hard choices made sort of from here on out. The European social welfare model of sort of accepting lower growth, but everyone gets sort of looked after, I think is reaching sort of its limits, and there are choices that need to be made. You can take on more debt, but really only Germany has that sort of breathing room. France and many others are sort of reaching against the limits of that, where markets will start to push back. So really, are politicians going to start leveling with people, and are people going to start being willing to tighten their belts or make some trade-offs? Right now, the publics don't want to hear it. So populists obviously offer easy answers. On the right, it's tax cuts. On the left, it's just let's just spend more. But are they going to have any more success in addressing any of these questions that the mainstream politicians are struggling to answer? And I think that's sort of a question that I think is going to be really interesting to watch in Europe in the coming years.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
Can I go back to Anna's point and maybe throw a question to Anna on this one about the rising of the rest to a certain extent? Because I was, particularly Donald Tusk, who I've known from my Brussels days, and I find that the rise of Poland in this conversation to be really interesting. I was on a panel a couple of days ago in Washington, and Jens Plotner, who's Schultz's national security advisor, was on it, and as well as Clément Beaune, who used to be a minister in the previous French government. And I put exactly that question, Anna, that you did about, hey, Trump showing up at a time when Macron is weak and Schultz is disappearing. Isn't this horrible? And Jens said, well, we got Donald Tusk, which is interesting from a German perspective, because, I remember very distinctly a few years ago when Radek Sikorski gave this big speech and says, I know it's very odd for a Polish minister to say this, but I fear German inaction more than I fear German action. And this weird detente, it's switching of places of Poland and Germany, where the Poles are now being looked at by the Germans as the leaders. It's just a really interesting development. Ivo, in some ways, kind of poo-pooed that, but what do you think about the ability of Poland in particular, but in coordination with the Balts and others, to be a new center of European, the new Europeans, as Rumsfeld termed them, as being a center of geopolitical authority? Is that a pipe dream, or do you think that's actually something that really could emerge over the next 6, 12, 18 months?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe 2 points on that. I think it first depends on how the inner Polish domestic politics develop, because right now Tusk is trying to roll back the populist changes and the justice reform, and he has very little room to maneuver because the president is still Andrzej Duda, and he's aligned with the former peace government, and he has struck down many of Tusk's attempts and sort of limiting what he can really do. This might change next year. They're having general elections. They have presidential elections in May, and if the peace is out of the presidential office, that will really strengthen Tusk and give him more room. And of course, he will have a great say in European politics because they are taking on the presidency of the European Council in January. So this will make his role more important too, I think. But of course, Ivo is right in saying that when you look at military might, when you look at financial power, the center is still Italy, France, and Germany rather than Poland and the Baltics, who are very aligned, I think, especially in their approach to Ukraine, more unified in their approach to Ukraine than the old axis of France and Germany and Italy. But of course, they lack some of the resources that would be needed. And then I think it's interesting to see when the next German government comes in, how it really handles Poland and the EU in general, because I think Scholz has been very negligent of European affairs. He rarely was in Brussels. He did not invest a lot of political energy in Brussels. When Biden came to Germany for his farewell visit, he invited Starmer of the UK and Macron of France, and he did not invite Tusk. They had a couple of meetings in the so-called Weimar Triangle, but Scholz didn't make that a priority either. So it's interesting that Jens Blödner said that outside Germany, it doesn't feel like that inside Germany. But Friedrich Merz, who might be the next German Chancellor of the Christian Democrats, he just held one of his first major foreign policy speeches here in Berlin the other day. On Wednesday, I was there, and he's really into that. So he says he really wants to tighten his relations with Poland, and he wants to reactivate the Weimar Triangle, get other Baltic states on board, get the Brits on board, and make that a new center. So there might be a new energy in that.
Well, I think that would be a very positive movement. I poo-pooed a little bit the Nordics and Poland, but they are right. They actually they are looking both on the Russian threat. They're increasing defense spending significantly. The Nordics are one of the few people who can have their cake and eat it too when it comes to social welfare. Not as much growth, but still a significant budgetary politics. So they are the example for the Germans and the French and others to follow. Hopefully, them and the Greeks, believe it or not, who are the fastest growing economy in Europe. Fascinating.
Well, the Swedes have turned very free market, by the way. It's
I mean, no, the Swedes, the Finns, and the Norwegians are. I mean, of course, the Norwegians have oil and gas, but they could be an example for everyone to follow. So let's hope that's the case, because my God, Europe is about to face a real storm when Donald Trump comes into office. Fascinating discussion, not necessarily uplifting, but we ranged literally across the globe. I want to thank Anna Sauerbrey of Die Zeit, Peter Spiegel of the Financial Times, David Luhnow of the Wall Street Journal, and thank all of you for tuning in. It's been a great conversation. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, I hope everyone has a great weekend.